This is the Hardware to Save a Planet podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Garrett.
Hello and welcome to Hardware to Save a Planet. Thank you. It's much more fun to say that in front of all of you than sitting at home in my basement. For people listening to this later, we are sitting here recording this episode in Las Vegas during CES in front of our very first live audience. And just gotta say, it's really fun to see everybody here. There's a lot of faces I know, a lot of people I've looked up to for my whole career, people running and founded some amazing companies that are doing really impactful work on positive impact on the people and planet. We have some of the best engineers and designers and technologists in the business in the room, so it's a really awesome crowd. And there's also a lot of people I don't know. So for those people I don't know, my name is Dylan Garrett. I lead our climate tech business at CES. I also run this podcast, Hardware to Save a Planet. I hope you will check it out after. We get to talk to awesome people like Nirav about hardware innovations that are addressing climate change. But yeah, really humbled to see everybody here. I am personally not worthy, but that's why I'm excited Nirav is here, because he is. Nirav is the founder and CEO of Framework. We're going to hear a lot about Framework today. He and I are going to have a little chat, and then afterwards we're going to do some Q&A. So think of some questions for Nirav while we go, and then hit those at the end. We're going to talk about a topic today that I think is really relevant to CES, which is how the consumer electronics industry is impacting the planet and what we can do to make it more sustainable. This is a really important piece of the whole climate change puzzle. I'm just going to share a couple stats to help kind of quantify it. On average, a person born in 1980 will produce 500 kilograms of e-waste in their life. That's 1,100 pounds of electronic waste. Only about 17% of that actually gets recycled properly. If you just think about this from a greenhouse gas emissions standpoint, and if we just look at laptops, manufacturing and shipping laptops, if like a laptop weighs 1 or 2 kilograms, that emits somewhere around 330 kilograms of CO2. We make about 300 million laptops every year, so that's 100 million tons of CO2 every year, which is equivalent to like all of the cars in California and their emissions for the year. So this is a big deal. I'm not by any means saying we should just ban consumer electronics, but our best lever to improve their impact on the planet is to reduce the number of them we use and make in the first place. And that's where Nirav's company Framework comes in. They're reinventing consumer electronics one category at a time to have a longer useful life. They're starting with a laptop that they've designed to be really easy to repair and upgrade by really anyone at home, so it doesn't need to be replaced as often. We have some pictures of it cycling there, and for listeners, we'll put some links to some images in the show notes. There's also a physical laptop there people can check out after the show. Time Magazine has called that laptop one of the best inventions of 2021. It has amazing rave reviews online. It's really an impressive piece of hardware, so I would really encourage people to check it out in person. To introduce Nirav quickly. Yeah, you like it. To introduce Nirav quickly, he has been on the inside of some of the most impactful consumer electronics companies of our time, Apple, and he also founded and led the hardware team at Oculus prior to the acquisition by Facebook and after the acquisition of Facebook. He is a self-described hacker and dreamer, and maybe most importantly, Nirav, I found in my research of you that you once ran a popular SpongeBob fan.
That was my first company.
That's your first company. How lucrative was that?
Not so lucrative.
Nirav, it's really an honor to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be here.
Just gonna start a little timer sway. So, Nirav, we actually have something in common. I also used to run a fan page for an old cartoon. I had a Simpsons fan page.
Was that lucrative?
It was.
You're starting a business, don't start a cartoon fans.
That's the main takeaway, right? But yeah, this is in the age of web counters and animated GIFs, probably a similar vintage. Yeah. Anyway, but we should stay on topic. So after the SpongeBob website, you did your undergrad at Carnegie Mellon in electrical and computer engineering. You then spent some time working on One Laptop Per Child project. And I find that really interesting because it's another kind of game-changing, trend-bucking laptop that's in your past. And I'm curious if that is a coincidence, or if there's some link between that and founding Framework 10 odd years later. And maybe you can share with people what that project was for people who are familiar with it.
Yeah, sure. So for folks who are not familiar with the One Laptop Per Child project, it was out of the MIT Media Lab. And basically, it was this idea that you could build an education system that was kind of self-contained around a computer. And one of the interesting things about OLPC actually was that they were very emphatic that it was not a laptop project. It was not a computer project. It was an education project. So it's really this use case driven, interesting little machine. And for folks who haven't seen it, it's this like extremely iconic machine. It's this little green laptop with like ears that flip up, and it's got this like cute little keyboard, and it was designed to be used by children primarily. And so the connection there was really just this idea of approaching a device with a mission in mind, and starting from the mission and then working backwards into what is the physical object that we need to build that mission. And that kind of threads through where we are today.
Yeah, if I remember, it had like really aggressive cost targets, right?
Yeah, it was infamously known as the $100 laptop. It was never actually available at $100, so they might have misfired on the marketing message.
So after that, you worked at Apple for a few years, and then you were the founding member of the hardware team at Oculus and built the Oculus hardware and the Oculus hardware team that then was acquired in 2014 by Facebook. You stayed on at Facebook for another 5 years. And I would love to know, you've spent some time with some of the leaders of the consumer electronics industry at Apple and Facebook. I'd love to know, from being inside those companies, what did you learn that motivated you to start?
Yeah, I would say I was not very close to the leaders in the consumer electronics industry at Apple. Maybe I could like see them occasionally from a distance, like skiing from one building to another. But really the thing I learned from Oculus especially was just how to move fast with a team that was all driven around a single vision. The first headset we built in Oculus, the DK1, the Rift Development Kit 1, we actually went from first prototype to shipping the product in about 6 months, which for folks who have built consumer electronics products before is like doesn't compute, like it doesn't calculate. And like looking back on that time period in late 2012, sorry, like years are way off, so long ago, to early 2013, even looking back on it, I still can't remember how it happened. There must have been a time warp involved at some point. But then the interesting thing is that we repeated that again with the second dev kit. We did it in about 9 months. It was a significantly more complex product. And it all just goes back to this idea of having a very singular use case in mind and having a team that's just aligned on making it work and then building the hardware to turn that thing.
That's amazing speed. Was there something about what then got you to kind of decide, look, I've got to go start Framework? What was it about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, after another 5 years at Facebook, working on VR primarily still during that time, it was just this like urge to go and be able to move fast again with a small team and again go back and address an interesting and important problem. And it was very clear to me, looking around consumer electronics, not just the things we were doing in Facebook or the things I saw in the past at Apple, but really broadly across the consumer electronics industry, seeing just a broken operating mode, a mode that kind of revolved around this idea that these very expensive, very advanced products that we're building over multiple years of R&D would become effectively temporary disposable items. You're sending it out into the world, a user uses it for a couple of years, and then it sits in a landfill. Maybe, ideally it gets recycled, but maybe it sits in a landfill for another 20,000 years. Like that little, 2 or 3 year window of it being in someone's pocket or on someone's desk felt just totally insane to me. It felt like there needed to be a better way to do this.
I gave some stats at the beginning about, greenhouse gas emissions and stuff, but I'd love to hear from you. Like, how would you characterize the problem that's causing that kind of mentality of throwing products out every couple of years? Why is that a problem for the planet? How would you characterize that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's really a problem across the entire life cycle. It's the resource extraction to create the device. It's the energy consumption that goes into building the thing. And then at the end, it's at the end of life, it going and sitting somewhere in a mostly unrecycled, finished form, or, probably for a few years living in your drawer of shame at home while your dead devices before going out into the environment. And, like you laid out, the numbers are just like mind-boggling if we think about just the total mass of material that's going into those products, and it's going to sit out in the world for, hundreds of times longer than our own human lifespans. It's just insane to think about.
Maybe this is a stupid question, but everything that ends up in the landfill, how should we think about that from why is that a problem for the planet? What does that do? Why is that bad?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's probably there's multiple factors here. One is the actual materials, especially thinking about environmental and human toxicity, whether it's in a landfill and potentially leaching out dangerous chemicals or going through a recycling supply chain that's maybe not, a good, well-designed one. Perhaps it's going into a developing country where materials are being pulled out in a way that's not necessarily safe to humans. All of that waste just becomes quite damaging, both environmentally and to humans.
It strikes me as we talk about this, I know, I personally know a lot of people who develop products at companies like Facebook and Apple and other big consumer electronics companies, and individually they want to do the right thing, right? They're motivated to do the best for the planet and make great products that last a long time. And I imagine that's true, at leadership levels at those companies as well. What is it about putting those individuals inside these big organizations that ends up leading to this situation we have?
Yeah, I imagine there's plenty of engineers in the audience here who are thinking right now about a specific product that they've worked on in the last couple of years and a thing they wanted to do to that product to make it easier to repair or use less harmful materials or be possible to potentially upgrade or just generally last longer. And they're thinking about that specific conversation they had in a meeting where they pitched it and they got shot down. And the challenge, of course, is that when you're building a product, you're balancing 100 different trade-offs. And unless you very explicitly, from the start of that product, put at the forefront this idea of longevity or repairability or minimizing environmental impact, it's never going to make it to the end of the product, because something else, whether that's ID refinement in a specific area or a specific material that someone wanted to use, or a door or a gap or whatever it is, the other thing that needed to be prioritized, that'll win unless you go into that product from the start knowing that you need it to last.
So it's just about having a really, like that being a really clear priority.
It's about
from the get-go.
Absolutely. It's about being a clear priority end to end within the company, and really critically, to make that work, it can't just be a design priority or an engineering priority. It has to be a business priority. The people writing the checks in that company have to look at the idea of longevity and say, that makes sense for our customers, it makes sense for our business, and we can be successful as a company if we embrace it. Otherwise, there will always be a tension between we need to sell more products, we need to optimize for performance or industrial design or other things, or we need to optimize for what's actually better for consumers and what's better for the environment.
So maybe you just answered my question, but I was going to ask, when you set out and said, look, I want to change the way the consumer industry works, did you consider changing it from the inside? Going back to Apple or going to Facebook and saying, let's do this differently.
Sure, that's good. I'm now having the flashbacks to those meetings that I've had as an engineer where there's a thing that I wanted to get done and it never made it to the finish line, fortunately. So it's just very clear to me that the way to get this done was to find a group of individuals. I've got some of the framework team here as well, who believed in this and who could come together and build something very quickly and prove that you can build a great, well-designed, high-performance product that is still easy to repair and upgrade.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good segue. That kind of lays out the problem really well and then leads to your solution, which is this laptop. And I want to get to the laptop in a few minutes, but maybe first, I know part of the solution is the way you run the business. So I want to talk about that. That's got to be everything from brand to the way I see it on your website, the way you talk about your work, your products, the way you communicate with your customers. So we want to talk about the way you run the business. And my first question there is, when you run this business, how do you weigh your mission to do good for the planet against, making money,
right?
Which, unless you're running a SpongeBob website, typically the goal. And I ask that because essentially your goal, as I understand it, is to sell fewer products than their competitors.
Yeah, which is kind of a lot of business model.
We're going to sell less. Anyway, so how do you kind of balance those?
Yeah, sure. To your point, that is exactly our business model. We go into categories and explicitly we want to reduce the total revenue of every product category that we enter, which is something you've never heard any CEO say ever, probably, but that is what we're doing. That's what we're doing in Framework. And it works for us because our business model is counter-positioned against the incumbents in the space. It doesn't matter to us that our products last longer because we're replacing products that don't last as long. So as long as we continue to capture market share from others who are operating in a less consumer-friendly or less environmentally friendly manner, that's a win for us, it's a win for consumers, and it's a win for the planet.
I think one thing that kind of exemplifies part of the way you approach this is what you were describing as your philosophy about Black Friday.
Right.
So maybe you can share that with people.
Yeah, so if you're I assume everyone here is in the consumer electronics industry, you're all familiar with Black Friday. It's the big sales holiday of the year, in the US at least. And normally you build your calendar as a company around being able to drive substantial sales on that day by discounting on that day, and on the flip side of that, making your products a little bit more expensive the rest of the year so you can pay for that day. We think that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to force consumers who are using their products every day of the year to have to think through, well, my product's not working right now, or it's broken, or I really need a new one, but I have to wait until November 26th, whatever day it lands on, and buy it that day. And so what we want to do instead, and what we have done, is actually convince people, explain to people that our pricing is stable. If you need the product because your product's broken, buy it when you need it, not when it happens to be the right day of the year. And that, again, works for consumers, it works for us because that revenue ends up being consistent across the year instead of landing just on a single day. And it discourages people buying products that they may not need just because they see it happen to hit that number on a specific day that drove them to make that purchase.
It feels like you're doing things differently enough that you'll need to really, you need your customers to have or potential customers to have a lot of trust in Framework, and that you're doing these for good reasons and not, everybody's always looking out for the gimmick or whatever. So how are you building trust with your customers?
Yeah, it's interesting. Ultimately, you have to build trust by delivering on the promise. So we built a product that we claimed was repairable and upgradable and customizable, and we put it out in the world and we showed, it's super easy to repair, it's super easy to customize, but obviously we couldn't show the upgradability because we didn't have anything to upgrade. So we had to follow up the next year and prove by actually releasing upgrade modules that we lived up to that part of the promise. And now when we make an announcement or we state something about the future, consumers know that we actually will deliver on what we're saying.
Yeah, and I just had what I've read forums and reviews of your company and stuff, and that it seems like that trust is something that people really, or that kind of mentality is something that people really appreciate. The other perspective I think about this from is investors. Your startup and trying not to sell very many products or whatever. But you raised a seed round in 2020.
Yeah, the Series A last year.
And a Series A, 18 million last year. So you've been successful raising money. What's your pitch to investors?
Yeah, believe it or not, it is the same pitch. We go to them and say, we're entering a $200 billion category. We're going to turn it into a $100 billion category. And it works. The pitch works. So really, it is the same. Like the idea of being able to go into a stagnant and in many ways broken industry and build inside of it and expand inside of it a better industry resonates with consumers, resonates with people who are looking for what company they want to work for, and it resonates with investors too.
It's impressive. I mean, especially, consumer hardware is notoriously hard to raise money for. I think, especially laptops. Like, when was the last time you saw a new laptop company?
Laptop for child, I guess.
One laptop for child 15 years ago. Yeah, that's what it is. I'm thinking about as you grow your business, I'm thinking about kind of audience sequencing.
Yeah.
So right now, there's a lot of people who just love the idea of being able to pop over their laptop and wear it. But eventually, the framework to kind of have the kind of impact you're talking about, people like my parents need to be able to buy this thing.
Absolutely.
And they're, they might initially be intimidated by the idea of carrying on a laptop. So they would call me and send it to me or something. What's the plan? How do you expand beyond this kind of?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Really, this is another lesson learned from Oculus, is really, really thinking deeply about your audience sequencing and making sure you're not building a product that's too far ahead of where your brand and your audience is, but really thinking through what's the right first audience, how do we scale that into the next audience, and the next one. And like I said, we started with people who kind of inherently get this idea that consumer electronics, and especially PCs, should be upgradable, they should be customizable, it should be modular. And that audience, from a single image or even a few lines of text about what we're doing, it clicks immediately. They get it, they understand why it's important, they understand why they would want it, and they are our audience today. But that is an audience that we can use to then be able to grow off of. Interestingly, for PCs especially, what we find is that for people who are making a purchase decision about a computer, for someone who is a tech enthusiast, they go to YouTube, where of course they see videos of the framework laptop. And if you're not a tech enthusiast, you go to your tech enthusiast friends and family and ask them, what laptop should I buy? And so having trust and buy-in, and really to some extent even love from that audience of enthusiasts, also even helps us get to those next audiences. And the interesting thing that we've also found is that this idea of being able to do a repair or open up a computer and replace a part of it, it's something that actually everyone can do. The only thing that's stopping them is the mental barrier of seeing that product as being something that they can open. Once they open it for the first time and really do anything at all inside of it, so that door opens in their mind, and now they see it as something it's mutable, right? It's not this sealed up, like, permanent object. It's something that they can go and open up and do a bit like this.
I have a little story on that. Well, I told you right before the show, but I'll share that. I bought a framework laptop and showed it in my house Tuesday night. Big cardboard box. My 4.5-year-old daughter goes over and we get the box together and open it up. Within 15 minutes, my 4.5-year-old daughter had opened up this laptop with the screen. It ships with a screwdriver. She had opened up the laptop. We popped the keyboard off. She was like popping components out. Like, that's one of her first experiences with a laptop now. And she's like, this is easy. I can go replace my speaker on my laptop or whatever.
Yeah, I absolutely love that, because the other thing is, like, if you didn't have that experience with her, the alternative might have been she has an iPad or another laptop or a MacBook or other devices in front of her, and the experience she has with her electronics product would be that they are these sealed up boxes. Being able to, like, have that experience of, like, I can look at that device and see it differently, it's just magical.
Yeah. The other thing about the hardware that I just really love is, when I first heard about it, or when I described the product to people, I said, look, you can open the thing up, every single component in there is socketed, which means it's connectorized, so you can just pop it out and put it back in. It's not soldered down. Apple solders everything down, glues everything together. Everything is disassembled. The first reaction I had was, well, it's going to be like super bulky, right? There's no way you can make a sleek, modern-looking laptop and do all of that. But somehow you've clearly done that. You can see the pictures here. I guess my question is like, how has Apple convinced us that that's the only way to make a sleek-looking laptop? And what are you doing to do it differently?
Sure, yeah, it's this kind of like cargo cult industrial design mentality where actually the bigger problem is not even so much that Apple is doing this, it's that Apple's been so successful with it that every other consumer electronics company looks at Apple's industrial design and the decisions that they've made and thinks, well, we have to do that too. Apple was successful, we're going to do it, we're going to be successful too. And they ended up making the same design trade-offs, but in ways that result in products that are not necessarily so seamless or so high performance as the Apple products are. So it's a problem that Apple has set the expectation that this is the pinnacle of consumer electronics and everyone else is chasing them down that hole. And so for us, we looked at that and said, no, we have to reset this, and we're going to do this by building a product that looks clean and simple and minimal, because it is clean and simple and minimal, but it has to be as repairable and as upgradable and as modular as we can within those constraints. So we didn't start with it's modular and upgradable and then go backwards into, okay, how do we make that look okay? We started with, let's make something that's the same weight and the same thickness and the same materials and just as clean looking as a MacBook Pro, but let's prove that we can do that and make it repairable, and that's what we did.
Mm-hmm. So you really care about setting your constraints from the beginning.
Absolutely. We don't want consumers to have to make that trade-off of, do I want the thing that's going to last longer, or do I want the thing that's thin and light and high performance? People want to have both, and so we made sure we could do both.
Right. Well, you knocked it out of the park. Can you give maybe some specific examples of what you're doing differently from a hardware design perspective than what would be sort of status quo today?
Yeah, sure. It's almost shocking, how small the steps are to go from a product that is sealed up inside or down to something that is totally upgradable and repairable. We have, of course, a brilliant industrial designer, Ming Chen, who's in Taiwan, who's been driving just a bunch of the thought behind that. But it's actually just simple decisions like deciding to make your fasteners exposed instead of hiding them under feet that are glued on. So you try to reach that fastener and now your foot is lost forever, basically. And things like keeping your fasteners captive so that when you unscrew it, it stays with the part that it's attached to instead of having a pile of fasteners at the end. You have to figure out what to do. We put QR codes and labels on everything, both on the outside and internally. So when you open it up the first time, if you're someone who's never been inside of a computer before, you know what every part is because it actually says what it is right on the part. And if you want a guide or replace a part, you can just scan the QR code and get right to it. And these are all things that you can take, and we've proven you can take a consumer electronics product like a laptop, keep it thin and light, keep it high performance, add those things, and make a product that is super easy to repair. It's not rocket science, but it isn't done, and it's not done primarily for business model reasons, I think, and industrial design mentality reasons.
I was personally surprised by the way you've integrated the display. I know it's a specific example. Can you share?
Yeah, so the display is actually behind a magnetic attached bezel. So normally in a laptop, a display is adhered into the top cover, and then there's a bezel that's adhered on top of the display. So if you crack your display, which is of course something that probably many of you in this room have experienced, you have to replace the entire top panel of your laptop, which is in many cases going to cost half the cost of the entire machine just to do that, if you can do it at all. So what we've done instead is make the bezel magnet attached, which also makes it color customizable, and then made the panel attached with fasteners with brackets in the corners. So you can just unscrew it with a screwdriver that comes in the box and replace just the display. You don't have to break the display at any point. It's just such a simple thing, but it's an obvious thing to do.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. And I would have thought, that make it really thick or big and ugly or something, but no, it's beautiful. And maybe just to say, you were just telling me, how big is your team?
We are 40 people across US and Taiwan. We were about 15 actually when we shipped the product the first time around.
Yeah. How big is Apple's, MacBook Air touchpad too? Probably hundreds of people.
Yeah, but again, like going back to the Oculus example, this was 18 months from starting the company to shipping the first product, and it was in the middle of a pandemic. It goes back to like you have a small team, you believe in a thing, and you work together and you do it.
Can you say that? I just want to. So, you founded the company
In basically the CES effectively 2020.
2020, right before we probably all remember the last time we were all here together at the CES, right before COVID. And 18 months later, you shipped your first product. I mean, that's incredible, right? That's insane. And that was going to be my next question. How'd you do it?
Well, it has a really incredible team.
Yeah.
It really does. So you can't. I mean, the team is what builds the product ultimately. So you have to find the right people with the right experience, like our supply chain lead menus here in the audience today. Just having that team, and really critically also having the right partners. The great thing about Framework generally, and specifically the notebook industry and the Framework laptop, is that there are many people in the world who know how to build notebooks. There are plenty of manufacturers in the world who build dozens of unique models and millions of units of notebooks a year. And so for us to go to them, we don't have to explain what a notebook is. They know what a notebook is. We only have to go in with, this is how our notebook is different. And that lets us move very quickly. But that is actually philosophically aligned with what we're doing at Framework. We don't want to invent new product categories. We want to go into those mature, stagnant categories where there is waste and inefficiency and consumer frustration and fix those. So it's every category we're going into works the same way, where there are people who know how to make the product. We just have to help them make it better.
Mm-hmm. So you're really intentional about what are you using partners to develop through a JDM or
that's
a JDM model, and what are you doing with your team, your small and powerful team in-house? Maybe we've already hit it in the last question, but what are some examples of some of the things that really differentiate a product that you have to do in-house versus use partners for?
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of it, of course, goes back to the industrial design. We've got our lead software engineer as well. We do a lot of firmware and electrical work to make that modularity and upgradability easy, having diagnostics to let people be guided through the experience very, very quickly. But it is just having like an architectural level understanding within the team across every functional area, because ultimately for a product this complex, all those pieces have to come together, and then being able to leverage those partners for the things that they already know how to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. Thinking about the future and the future of Framework, I'm curious where you see the company and maybe, I don't know what the right time is, but what's that sort of, I don't know if there's an end state or goal. What do you want to grow to be in 10 years, 15 years? What is that?
Yeah, I'd say there's a few things. One is in 10 years from now, we would hope that every Framework laptop that we ship down to the world is still in use in some form, that it's been, Theseus laptop into continuing to work for that length of time. Yeah, and even if it's not in the laptop itself, one thing that we also focus on is making sure that the modules, as people upgrade them, can be reused outside of the laptop. So when we released a new mainboard, for example, we released a 3D printed case design so that people can take their old mainboard, drop it into the case, and have this little second PC. And philosophically, again, it goes back to this idea of let's divert as much as we can from that landfill or that recycling flow, and instead actually have it be a productive item that offsets needing to manufacture something new. So that's really one key element of it. And then the other is, of course, that we want to take this model that we've proven in the notebook space and bring it to the rest of consumer electronics. So we're going category by category. And again, this goes back to promising things that we can't actually show yet, but I can promise that we are going into categories beyond the laptop and basically bringing this similar model of being able to buy a product with the expectation that it lasts, and doing so by making it modular and repairable and upgradable, and cutting in half the total revenue in those categories.
Making this one. I know you can't tell me what products you're shipping next. Can you talk about even the selection criteria? For something that has the biggest impact, environmentally or certain price points?
Yeah,
How
no,
do
it's
you decide?
really key. We look at stability, we look at stagnation, we look at basically categories where the use cases are stabilized. If the use cases are still unknown or still evolving, then realistically we can't lock in a form factor and a feature set and have that product last because the use cases are going to evolve beyond the quantification point. And so for notebooks, for example, the use case has been stable for decades at this point. So we can go into notebooks and have confidence that we can lock in and design an architecture and make it long-lived. And if we look across consumer electronics, there are, of course, a lot of categories where that applies. So that's the first filter is stability. Then the second filter is really that we like categories that do have that enthusiast audience that we can bootstrap off of. There's that audience that can immediately benefit from having something that is super customizable to their specific needs in a way that the existing products that are available aren't. So that gives us this audience that we can go to, have something that just absolutely blows their minds, gets them the exact product that they wanted, and then be able to ladder up to the next audience, next one.
Makes a lot of sense. There wouldn't be much point in making like a set of VR goggles,
Right, yeah.
something that lasted 20 years.
Exactly. It's not done yet. It's not made.
Makes sense. I have a few closing questions for you. I ask these of all of my guests on the podcast. How optimistic or pessimistic are you about the future of our planet and why?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm an optimist by nature, and you kind of have to be if you're starting a company. If you're an pessimist, the company's not going to last very long. I am optimistic. I think, especially looking at what folks in younger generations are doing, like at a deep level, they've internalized the damage to the planet and what needs to be done to avoid making things worse. And I do see a lot of hope there, and I'm optimistic that consumers, that creators, that engineers, all of us together are going to be able to find solutions to be able to redirect our energies and our brain power towards building things that are better instead of staying on the same path.
Who's one other company or person doing work in this space that's inspiring you right now?
Yeah, we're inspired a lot by Fairphone, actually. Folks in Europe who are building basically ethics-first smartphone. And for them, actually, they've gone even beyond enabling repairability. They actually go deep into the supply chain and think through ethical manufacturing and ethical material sourcing. We look at that stuff that actually now we're starting to explore and think through how we can do things that are similar. And smartphones, of course, are an even more challenging category, maybe like by an order of magnitude more than notebooks. We really respect them for going in and attacking such a challenging problem.
How do smartphones fit your
Sure. I would say if you think back to the two filters that I just shared, they do fit both filters pretty well.
We have a room full of people here who,
Sure, yeah.
Okay. We have a room full of people here who are currently in the product development industry. A lot of them are either working at companies that develop, that make and manufacture consumer electronics or other products, or consulting for companies like that. What advice would you have for people to?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. If you're at a big technology company, you should leave and start a company to compete with them in a more efficient way. Honestly, it's maybe never been a better time to start a company. Looking at the carnage in the tech industry right now, you might think like, well, that's crazy. Is it really? But that level of churn and chaos out there in consumer electronics and technology broadly right now is actually the perfect time to go out there and start something new. It helps that literally everything is in excess right now. If you need partners, manufacturing partners, you need materials, you need designers, engineers, everything is there waiting for you. Go and do it.
Well, it's a good perspective. Different mindset than we had a year ago. Nirav, that was really fun. I'm going to stop talking and we give up the floor for people in the audience to ask questions. If anyone would like to ask a question. Yes.
Right there. Yeah, it's on. Right there.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty good. Well, first of all, thank you. I think that was really exciting to hear what you're doing. And I think there's an opportunity to do good and do well. At the same time, we're seeing a huge shift from product to service. And it feels like there's an opportunity with repairs, as you are, and aftermarket services, for you to actually drive revenue and be sustainable at the same time. So perhaps there's a both, a win-win, where you continue to do what you're doing, addressing all these categories, teaching others how to do it, but also drive top line with the bottom line revenue services that your customers need.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really goes back to this idea of not thinking about selling the product to the person, that moment of sale, but really thinking through that lifetime of experience with the product that that person has for, not that, for, potentially 5 or even 10 years. And then again, to your point, looking at like, how can we as Framework help that person along that time frame? And you're right, it is a win-win for consumer and for us.
And I should clarify, I quote funny a little bit for a business with a goal of selling fewer products, but there's still a lot of money to be made, right? If you reduce that 300 million laptops a year to 150 million, there's still a lot of laptops to be sold and made. So my understanding is the goal is still to make money.
That is, and actually one part that maybe we didn't touch on as much is just that part of what we're doing is building an ecosystem. We're building even a marketplace around that ecosystem. And there are actually parts of the laptop that we've opened up publicly and put up on GitHub for people to be able to build their own versions of, like the expansion card system, for example, where people can choose their own ports. That's actually up there in the reference designs documentation. So any individual or any company can download those files, make their expansion card, and expand on the Framework laptop ecosystem. And that helps, of course, that person, it helps the consumers using those modules, but it also helps us in that we get to facilitate that ecosystem growth and we benefit from it financially.
Right. So there's another question over here.
Guys, we got this.
I'm curious what the biggest challenges Framework have. I'm curious what the biggest challenges Framework is
Facing right now?
Yeah, I mean, like, what's next on your list that keeps you open?
Sure, that's an interesting question. I would say that audience expansion is hard. I mean, we're being very deliberate about our sequencing, but building a brand that can resonate with both enthusiasts and next audiences beyond is not trivial. There are very few companies who have balanced that successfully. So that is one challenge that doesn't necessarily keep me up at night, but it is something that we put a lot of focus on.
There's one here in the middle.
Yeah, about a decade ago, Motorola Mobility and Google sunk a lot of capital into the oil phone, which was a somewhat similar concept. Are there some lessons learned, some dark alleys that you were able to take from that journey and course correct?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So we did take a lot of lessons from that. I've spoken with a bunch of people who worked on Aura. And so the problem with Aura was that the product, it's conceptually brilliant. The concept was the priority rather than the product execution and how people could actually use the product day to day. And the challenge they had was that it was super easy to take these magnet attached Lego block style cards, swap them around and make that work. But they ended up with a product that was heavier and thicker and more expensive and more power hungry and more fragile than the iPhones and Samsung Galaxies and other smartphones that consumers could buy instead. So side by side, it was a very hard sell for that consumer to look at those two things and say, I'm going to take all those trade-offs to get that super easy hot swap ability. And that's why for us, we really did start from the beginning of it has to be the safe size and weight, it has to look seamless, it has to feel robust, it has to be competitive with the MacBook Pro and the Dell XPS and the other products. And then within those constraints, it's make it as modular as we can.
Wondering if you could touch on the internal limit. One of the other things we see how it's actually inspire the products beyond the field and the features that we talked about, and they have existing products that they know using virtual materials. So we look for
consumer recycling materials or other novel or sustainable options. And we can't justify mentioning that. So what we're doing is talking your process and how it can.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing that we do get to do that's nice is that because we're so small, we get to be downstream of all the big consumer electronics manufacturers. And whenever we go to suppliers, we'll find oftentimes that one of the big notebook makers or the consumer electronics makers will have tested a very environmentally friendly material, like, for example, a higher percentage post-consumer recycled content, aluminum or plastic, but they didn't feel like they could either take the risk or take the cost hit or get a large enough volume of the material to put in their products. And so we let them put all the expense into vetting the material, and we get to use it because we're small and agile and it's easy for us to make those decisions. The other thing though is that every part of the product is replaceable. So if we made a material choice, we built a mechanical part or sub-assembly with it, and 5 years later it ends up wearing out in some way, you can just replace that part with the newer version that maybe we've improved on and keep using the product.
Yeah, very impressed with what you guys are doing at your company. I was curious, the circuit board is the most damaging to the environment. And don't you really need to have the whole supply chain, the chip industry, building chips on the same package and support to be able to do an upgrade? Talk about it.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. We've been very careful about basically designing our mainboard form factor in a way that we have flexibility to be able to go generation to generation within the constraints of the mainboard. So basically we define those interfaces like USB-C or the battery connector, the display connector in a way that we know we can keep that stable, but within the balance of that mainboard, as long as those interfaces and mechanical boundaries are the same, the thermal system is the same, we can move around anything, we can replace any chip, we can keep going generation over generation, and we've been able to make it work. And that's not to say that's going to continue to work forever. It may be we reach a point in time where something changes, where we have to hit the reset button and change the form factor, but rather than being something that happens every year like it does for most consumer electronics products, we can stretch it out to many years before those points.
I think we have time for one more question. And then, Nirav, are you going to stick around?
Yeah.
Maybe you can find him over a beer. Go ahead.
Sure, I think you kind of touched on this already, but a lot of times when you upgrade a CPU, I don't know if it's just like in more PMs, but you kind of have to replace the motherboard at the same time. So every 5 years or so, you end up kind of having to start from scratch. Maybe that's what you're talking about already, but how do you envision how do you want to experience? Is that self-replacement?
Yeah, sure. So for notebooks specifically, the CPUs are soldered down. And so what we do is basically remove as much expense as we can from the mainboard and socket memory, storage, Wi-Fi, and then make the mainboard itself more or less the value of it is really in that CPU, and then designing that mainboard itself to be upgradable. And that becomes, of course, very doable, whereas we try to make the CPU itself its own module that would be kind of swimming against what would work as a notebook today.
Cool, Nirav, thank you very much. That was really fun. I learned a lot. Obviously, people are really engaged with what you're doing and really impressed. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great to be here.